Hey, everybody, and welcome to The Brand Called You. So, I was recalling an incident that happened to me, I want to say 20 years ago when I had just bought my first house. I finally, in my late 30s, was able to afford a house. Mortgages were cheap at the time, and it was a total fixer-upper. And I remember I had a front porch. It was a little mudroom, so small, maybe 4 by 6. And I had bought those little cheap stick down tiles, and I was just going to retile the mudroom. And my Hungarian mother called me to see how things are going. She goes, "Tell me, darling, how is it?" I said, "I'm putting down my own tiles." And without missing a beat, she said, "Don't do it." I said, "What?" She goes, "Don't get somebody. Don't. You could hurt yourself." It was hysterical, but it was not a dialogue I hadn't heard my whole life. My mother genuinely was frightened that something horrific might happen if I put down those small little tiles. Thank God I didn't listen to her, and maybe I should have because the job was not good. But it really reminded me of how trauma can be passed down so easily and so absorbed by multi generations. I probably have spent the better part of my adult life trying to deconstruct what is a real fear, what is an imagined fear. And that's why I was so fascinated to learn about and read about the work that Tovah Klein, our guest today, has been involved with. She is a child psychologist who is also the director of the Center of Toddler Development at Barnard, where she's an adjunct associate professor. But she's really spent her life researching children's social and emotional development and parental influences on early development. She's the author of the wildly successful How Toddlers Thrive, What Parents Can Do Today to Plant the Seeds of Lifelong Success. And she's also the author of a riveting book called Raising Resilience. And I'm so excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
happy to be here.
Yeah, I mean, you're here's the deal. You sent me an advanced copy of your book, Raising Resilience, which is going to be published in a few months. And I have to tell you, I thought I was going to be reading a book about advice to parents of young children. I found myself crying. I mean, I was deeply emotionally moved, and I had to really sit back and think why. And I think it was because, my mother, a Holocaust survivor, was of an age and a culture in which they didn't talk to therapists. I mean, she used to say to me, "They're for crazy people." Um, and didn't think in any way that her trauma was affecting me. And of course, it had. And it was very moving for me that you are thinking about traumatic events and how they affect young children and parents, and how the damage is not inevitable. And I'm just fascinated by this. So I guess my first question to you would be, what drove you to think about this book, Raising Resilience?
Yeah. So there's so many prongs to this, like my professional life and my personal life. So I'm glad you asked that question. A number of things. I'm going to start with the personal.
Hmm.
I also was raised by a mother who had her own traumatic upbringing, but again, it wasn't framed that way. So she was not a Holocaust survivor. She was born here to Hungarian father, interestingly. And
Hungarians are very morose.
yes, during the war, she was born in 39. And so one of the things she used to talk about is being afraid as a child and hiding under her desk and afraid of what was going to happen. So I think it was in her family, this fear. But when she was a teenager, she had a much younger sister who died of leukemia. And she was kind of a parent to that child because that baby was born when she was 2. So that when my mother was 12 and the baby died, she was 3. So that kind of pervaded my mother. And then a few years later, when she had her own young child, my brother, she was in a very serious accident. She was hit by a car and she wasn't expected to live. My brother was 6 months old. She survived, but she was a young mother who had lost a sister, who had almost lost her life, separated from her infant. So this kind of pervaded my mother, who was a big personality and passionate and all these other pieces. So she did very well in life in some ways, and in other ways, she just passed down this trauma. And I was the daughter almost like a replacement for that baby. So I didn't know any of that. I just knew that I was fascinated with death growing up. Fast forward, as a teenager, I worked with a group of children in a summer program. It was my first paid job. Remember, we had to get working papers. I was very proud of it. And there was a child there named Emma. And Emma was being removed from her mother's care permanently because of abuse. But anytime a limit was put on her, she was told, she couldn't hit other people, she couldn't throw things, something like that. She was like 4 or 5. She would scream for her mother. And that was the beginning of it for me. Like, wait a minute, there's two things going on here. One is she's deeply hurt and abused enough that the courts are removing her, but also she wants that parent. And I'm thinking that parent would come in and hurt her. So all of that, fast forward, sort of led me to a career of really fascination with the harm that can be done to children, but also what that parent-child relationship is and how badly a child needs protection. And so that led me into this field of trauma. It wasn't even called that at that time when I was in graduate school getting my PhD, but I was interested in people, adults. I did a lot of work with adults who had survived these horrific, whether it was abuse or something else. And that led me to a career doing two things. One is working with children and families on a day-to-day basis. Every day is stressful.
Mm.
Every day is uncertain.
Mm.
And also in the field of kind of large scale devastation. So, 9/11, I did some work in Japan after the tsunami of 2011. I was there in 2013. So really thinking about on the individual level, what are those day-to-day kind of hurts and uncertainties? What happens when somebody flees a fire or a flood in their house, like a natural disaster, and then also large scale. So I put those two together to really think about, well, what role does that parent play? Because parents can buffer that, or parents unknowingly, inadvertently can kind of take ourselves and pass that down to the children. And that's where I really got interested in the psychology of development over time, because this is true whether your child's 2 or 12 or 20. And that's sort of been my career path because I love children and families.
But, as I was reading your writing, it occurred to me that there's different types of trauma. So, for example, and I want to talk to you about this. You ran your program at Barnard during the pandemic. That's a specific, a kind of one-shot trauma.
Mm-hmm.
9/11 one-shot trauma that no doubt has indelible effects. But I wonder, sort of in the case of my mother, who, was, I think permanently, in some ways, permanently damaged by the Holocaust. And it's something that she seems to have walked around with. I guess what I'm asking is there a difference in the way we can bounce back or be resilient when you and your parent or your otherwise healthy parent have experienced a trauma together in a one-shot way, or whether you're the recipient as the child of a very long-standing, insidious kind of trauma that a parent has experienced?
Yeah. It's a good question because I would also start with that a
Sorry to interrupt
traumatic.
you, but I guess what I'm asking is there a
Yeah.
hierarchy of trauma?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have to be careful when we say that because
Yeah.
how someone is affected by an experience, a negative experience, whether we call it trauma or severe stress, varies. So there's partly the incident, an overwhelming Holocaust, the earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster of Japan, right? These are big events. Um, the Holocaust may stand out separately, but there's plenty of war.
Yeah.
There's this genocide in Rwanda. I'm sorry to say that there are many horrible things that humans do to humans. And then there's abuse, which can be ongoing, but there's also other sort of more insidious ongoing trauma. What we know is that the person themselves, so what they bring to it, what foundation they have,
Mm.
what age this happens at, you know, a, a teenager is going to react differently to a situation and they have a whole history of a relationship with a parent. than a 2-year-old who's really newly in formation. So there's what the child brings to it, there's their temperament, but there's also the support they get either at the beginning, middle, or end, depending on what the stress or trauma is. And there's how much they're believed, how the ability to talk about it. So if you think about the Holocaust survivors, for many years, for most of them, there was a silence. And there was a strength, right? For people who survived and were able to, reestablish life, whether it was in the US or somewhere else, like your parents, your mother sort of said, I'm going to move on. The question is, what happens to that festering, real lived experience? And then with things like abuse, if a child is supported through that, believed, listening to children, listening to humans is such an important quality. So if you're not heard, if you're not able to express what happened to you because it's so hard, all of those pieces are factors. So what we know, which again is what gets me into this field of working with children and families every single day, is the event itself is just one piece of the equation. The reaction to it has many, many factors, and the harm, whether it's going to be lasting or not, also has many factors. So I think of it more like, how does somebody take that and incorporate it into their narrative of self and their well-being or their hurt being? And what are the factors that help somebody incorporate this in a way that doesn't harm them?
I was wondering, you obviously observe parents and children all the time. So just using my mother as an example, I always felt that if she would actually remember what happened, the death of her family, this and that, it would be worse for her. I actually felt like she was keeping herself sane and alive by holding on to her secrets. Now, so having said that, it made it impossible for my mother to do what she needed to do as a parent to make my life safe.
Right.
Do you ever witness a parent who how do you handle a situation where a parent is holding on to trauma and can't necessarily provide the pillars of what she would need to do what you think would be best for
Right.
a young person? Can they get the support from other people, from teachers, from friends, or
Mm-hmm.
is there any way you can? I'm very interested in how you work with people that are not willing.
Right, right. Well, often I don't know somebody's background, right? So I run this center at Barnard College, which is the college across the street from Columbia University. So, it's Barnard and Columbia students and,
Mm-hmm.
faculty doing research. And so we have families from the community, from New York City, sometimes New Jersey, sometimes Connecticut. Um, and then parents that I work with, say in parent groups and in individual consultations. So those are parents of older children or teenagers, now young adults. Like, the longer you work in a field, the more your range goes. And it's not that I always know what's going on with somebody, but when they come to me for help, to say like I'm having this issue with my child,
Mm.
or I'm running into something with my teenager, and it may have been something that they could have predicted from earlier or not. My question is, what does this parent bring to this? Like sometimes it is specific to that child, and maybe that we need to figure out what's going on with the child. Usually it's I need to have some understanding of who this child is
Mm.
with the parent, sort of co-creating that understanding. And then when there's like what I consider a roadblock, like that parent's really having just a tough time seeing what this child needs. Maybe this 17-year-old needs some more independence. Why is that so painful for this parent? It takes a lot of empathy on my part because empathy and compassion is the first piece to connecting to somebody
Mm.
and really going at that person's pace, right? You can't go into somebody and say, look, you're holding on to something and it's ruining your relationship. It's really building a bridge, trying to build a bridge as best I can. And that's trying to understand the parent. And then there are times that I've said to somebody, like, I don't know your history, but I feel like there's something here so worrying to you. Right. So it's, a matter of can I help that person open up a little bit to realize how this piece is now impacting their relationship? It's not that I think everybody needs to, um, nor would it be good for, you can't force somebody to say, I've got something deep down. It's a question of how slowly can I go, or if they're in therapy, which I encourage people to be when they're in pain or their relationships in pain, can they slowly in time approach what's stopping them or a piece of it? But you're bringing up something really important, which is, I would consider survival. I mean, what your mother survived is overwhelming to the human experience. Humans should be connected and caring and loving. And we know that that's not always the case. We know that right now. We knew that, when we learned that the Holocaust had happened. So that's an overwhelming experience that overwhelms the brain, the body, the heart, the soul. And the fact that she stood back up and not only survived, but was able to move and marry and have a family, even with hurts to you, still shows you the strength of the human spirit. Like, I need to put that somewhere so that I can survive. Would there be a way to reach that part of her? There may be, with, the right connection with a therapist, but it's a slow train, I would say, to help somebody touch that very, very frightening part of themselves.
Maybe you experience this as well, but I mean, so I do, I was a storyteller. Now I do coaching with, in corporations. And one of the things I find is that my early experience having to read my mother's moods and have like this hyper radar, because I was eggshelling it all the time. It's worked so well for me in terms of really
Yeah.
being able to understand what people's stories mean, what they're feeling, even before sometimes they do. I don't know if you feel that you have a similar gift because of
Yes.
experience. Yeah.
Your upbringing, and who you are, is partly this inborn, what we call temperament. Um, it's a biological piece. We come into the world. I know this from having three babies, right? They come into the world, touch them for the first time, they're wired already. And we know this from neuroscience too. Like, there's connections in the brain, body, soul, like all of that. And then they're nurtured along. So you obviously you can help smooth out some of that. It's why we have young children who aren't speaking yet can go to speech therapy. And I always tell a parent, it's like the wires are all there. They're just not quite connecting yet, and a little help. But the child is who the child is. And I was by nature, I'm 100% sure, looking at photos from when I'm little, an observer,
Yeah.
very tuned into the world. And it did me well with a mother
Mm-hmm.
who could be joyful and certainly loved me, but I needed to be vigilant for my own survival. I needed to monitor. And those skills were like a natural, partly for my personality, observing, always taking it in, thinking about what's going on, and to become a psychologist of some kind, like to go this path of humans, I think is a natural path. And in some ways, it's a gift. I had to do my own work on understanding myself, like why these struggles, why these emotional, hardships for me. And, we all have to get to a place, I think, of understanding ourselves and not blaming that person. You don't have to necessarily accept some of the interactions, particularly if there was, abuse, but I had more of like an emotional, a mother who was high or low,
Yeah.
lots of good things, lots of hard things, particularly because she had one daughter. And it took me years to really come to some understanding and to accept that she wasn't going to change. Insight for her was very hard. And I think maybe like your mother, it was
Yeah.
painful. It was deeply painful. She had a sister who died, who she was like the third parent to. And I think the shame and the vulnerability and the hurt was too much for her. And it took me a long time to accept that she wasn't going to change.
Mhm.
That made me angry for a long time.
Yeah. I'm so fascinated to learn what you were running your program when the pandemic happened. I mean, what was that like? I'd be so interested to know. It must have been also very new for you, this scenario.
Yeah, yeah. It was new for everybody. As the president of my college said to me in like one of our first meetings, there's no playbook here. And but what no playbook does is two things. On the one hand, it's like, oh no, but it also pulls for innovation, quick decision making, and then thoughtful decision making, um, and a lot of leadership skills. I joke that even though I had been doing this work, running this program for probably 25 years at that point, there I was a professor, I juggled all these things, research, running this program, teaching college students, being a mom. But the no playbook allowed me to force me to be creative. And I realized for the first time what leadership was. People say, oh, you're a
Mm,
leader. And I'd say, oh, I'm at this, wonderful college and, oh, it's a small program. It just has a big sort of, worldwide acknowledgement kind of thing. But all of a sudden I realized what leadership was, which was I had to be steady. So the first thing we did when that shutdown happened, and I'm so, I guess, Pollyannish. I was like, oh, it's ridiculous that this college is closing so early. Barnard and Columbia closed down as one of the first universities after Stanford. I was like, oh, this is overdoing it. And then I told my staff, we'll be back in 3 weeks. And within a week, I realized that's not happening. So I had to just move into a mode of we can do this. And our first meeting on Zoom with all my teachers and our college students who work with the children, I just kept saying to people, yeah, we're going to do an online program. And my staff was looking at me on this screen. I had never been on a Zoom screen with all these squares with this look of like, what? And I was like, yeah, sure, we'll do this. The whole time thinking, I don't even know how to make a video, right? Thank goodness I have young staff because they were all like, oh, we can make videos. And what we did was we said, what's important? What's the basis of the work we do? And in this program that I run it's for 1.5 to say 3.5 year olds. So it's like a preschool. Um, our whole basis is on security, safety, trust, helping children feel safe. So we said, well, the first thing we need to do is connect to them where they are in their homes and let them know that we're all okay. We're
mm,
home with our families, just
mm,
like you're home with your family.
yeah.
And that was the beginning. And so we did an online, toddler program. And, that could be a whole other session. I mean, we have a lot of laughter when we look back. We had, for each group of children, we had a rotating 8 students who kind of rotated through the group. And then we had like 2 to 3 teachers, certified teachers. And then we had people like me and my associate director. So we all came on the screen with 12 children and parents who didn't know how to do Zoom yet. And so you can imagine these, basically 2 to 3 year olds with all these boxes. It was ridiculous. Teachers
Oh,
were wonderfully creative. And it took a few weeks for the teachers to say, Tova, we think you shouldn't be on the screen with us. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. Because they were so worried,
why?
I'd be insulted or something. And then I realized, wait, the students shouldn't be either. And all the teachers, like, we need to bring this down. So we slowly realized half groups and maybe 2 teachers. And then it became
Yeah.
quarter group, like maybe just 4 children on a screen. So over time, it evolved and we connected to the children. The teachers basically did routines from the classroom. Okay, we're going to have snack together and would send out something to the parents saying, we'd like to do a spreadable snack today. That could be hummus or butter or whatever you want. And then children could share a little bit of their home life or their culture, right? Because what you eat at home is going to be culturally based. So it got better. And then in the fall, we were able to open in a beautiful tent on our college campus, even though
Wow.
Barnard was completely shut down,
Mhm.
was still online. I had to convince the president, the administration that we had to open, and I had the complete support of Barnard, which I'm very grateful for. And we opened outside. Again, had no idea what we were doing, but we took all these good principles of child development, routine, consistency, and everybody was, if you remember September 2020, I mean, parents had been home with those children, those babies with them every day, close to them. They wanted to separate. They
Yeah.
wanted them to have a little socialization, but everybody was scared. And we were concerned about getting COVID even outside.
Yeah.
So we just went into it like in a day by day. We're going to figure this out with the parents. The other piece that I realized recently is I surrounded myself with a few other early childhood program directors, which was really important because typically, because my program sits in the psychology department, I'm surrounded by psychology people, which is really kind of where my brain is. For this, I needed those people that I trusted in the early childhood field. And we became like a pod, mainly
Yeah.
on email, sometimes
Yeah.
by phone, sometimes by Zoom, of support for each other. And I realized in that we didn't get isolated, this
Mm.
small group of us. And there are all these questions coming up that we couldn't have predicted, like, do you have dolls with hair or is that a COVID risk? I mean, these very mundane. Our first COVID case in the tent, which was a parent. I'm emailing these other journalists. Has anybody had a COVID case yet? I mean, we were all kind of on the front line of reopening schools and trying to figure it out. And we did. We
I mean,
did.
did the kids express fear and were you able to talk directly about that?
Yeah, I would say because the children were so young, it wasn't I guess it is fear-based separation. It was more, how are we going to separate children from their parents gently and slowly, like we
Right.
always do, who've been home? Some of them from the time they were like just over a year to now almost two, they've been with the parents almost solely. Lots of parents who were without jobs, right? Because there was all those layoffs, were literally home with their children. And so we thought very delicately about how we're going to do that. So I guess, yes, in the way that young children express fear, children who are very held within, unable to play initially, staying very close to a parent, but usually what you see is them, slowly moving out. That slowness got slower.
Yeah.
Our attempts to connect to some of the children had to be that much more delicate. But the good news was in time, even those children who were really holding back, or the ones who were coming in like gangbusters, which we always have, but there was like that much more of it, so the highs were
Yeah.
high, the
Yeah.
sort of withdrawn was more. In time, everybody moved forward. We had to give it more time. Like we owed it to the children
Yeah.
to go to where they were or where they are rather than thinking, oh, they need to move
Yeah.
forward, which is tends to be like an adult perspective. They need to do this. We were like, that child needs more time with the parent, at our program, but the parents staying longer, or we need to make extra efforts to connect to that child quietly. So we had to think those nuances through even more.
Um, I guess I want to end on something you said in your book, which is that trauma doesn't necessarily mean complete scarring. You said that we children and parents have the capacity to change, but not necessarily be scarred from an event like this if certain factors are in place. And
Mhm.
I would love to hear just maybe you could reiterate what those
Yeah,
factors
yeah.
are.
So there's a number of factors. One is what the child and parent bring to this to begin with, like who they are.
Mm.
Another is the parent's ability to recognize their role in this and what I call ground themselves. I read a lot about this in the book. First take care of yourself in the moment. Like, I'm safe
Mm.
or I'm going to get to safety. But when the parent is grounded and sort of can exhale a bit, then they can help the child
The oxygen
regulate.
mask on yourself first.
Yeah. And I always say, like, oh, I used to think, oh, that's a ridiculous, that analogy, but it's true. First, I have to put my oxygen on. I have to exhale. I have to just get a little steady once you're out of the immediate crisis, right? Then I'm there for my child because children absorb parents, absorb. They're like sponges for the parent. That's what you and I experienced. We absorbed our parents until we unwind it. Um, so the second is emotion regulation. This is talked about a lot It's a huge field of study in developmental science and in neuroscience. So can I help my child get through the scary, the fear, and help them come down in their arousal? Yes, something bad happened, and now we're safe. So that's a deep connection to the child. And then a really important piece is what I call the narrative. You're a storyteller. What's the narrative that we help co-create with a child or a teenager around what happened? Right? That was a very scary event, and we got to safety. And, what are those other pieces that go into it? So a parent who's still very frightened themselves and is having trouble controlling that or containing that or is isolated may keep conveying fear to the child. But there's lots of ways we can get to know ourselves as a parent so that we can help create the narrative. And then the other piece I would say is listening to your child, like really hearing where are they? I have this question all the time from parents on day-to-day stuff. She says she's fine with her friend who's completely ghosted her on, social media or whatever it is. I'm not sure if she's fine. And I said, well, if your child's telling you they're fine, then you accept that and you say, I'm here if you want to talk at any point. You have to listen to where they are and not hoist our own worries and fears on them. So that takes a lot of self-work and reflection, but also finding some company or community. That might be one friend, that might be a group of people. That's what AA does for people with alcoholism or addiction, right? Not being isolated in it. So we can be grounded and then help reground our child, I think is
You
really
have
the
some
key.
amazing stories in your book about parents putting their stuff on the kids, which in and it's fascinating to me. But you said something very interesting. You said co-narrative, and
Mm-hmm.
that's very interesting, as opposed to a narrative you're deciding your children should have. You're
Yeah.
really kind of improvisationally creating a narrative
Yeah.
collectively, which is very different.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
yeah,
Do you remember that movie Life is Beautiful
yeah.
about the Holocaust? So that father, I don't know if your listeners have seen this movie, but it's in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And it's actually a very hard but delightful and many moments of poignant humor because this father takes it upon himself in a concentration camp to create fun and humor for his child. He's protecting his child every step of the way. He's like, I'm going to try to create a buffer in one of the world's worst situations. It's that buffer on the every single day and then in crisis that a parent has a capacity to provide. And if they don't provide it right away, there's the going forward where we can redo and help the child. So it's not that this is easy by any
I had a
means.
different take on that movie. I actually wrote
Yeah.
about it.
Oh, you did?
For the New York Times. I thought he was also the child of war survivors, the filmmaker and the star of the film. And I thought it was he was doing what I was doing as a kid, which is rewriting his what he wished would have
Oh,
happened during the war.
yes.
I thought he was
Yes.
rewriting it to make it work
Yeah.
in a more optimistic way. But either way, it worked, you know.
Yeah, and it's that more optimistic that protects the child. Right? Children need not a lie, but optimism. Like this is hard and we can get through it, or we did get through it, or that was scary, and now we're safe. So it's listening to the child and creating this other narrative.
I know
Uh,
we're out of time, but I just have one last question, which is I feel like optimism is so cultural. It's so American. I mean, I lived
yeah.
in the Netherlands for many, many years, and they used to, if you would be too optimistic, they say you're so American. They would just look down upon it. I mean, do you not find that there's cultural differences and that maybe the optimism always the
You know,
right
I,
thing to do?
I think it's a language thing. I love the question. Optimism needs to be genuine. It's not,
Oh,
I think
yes,
you get kind
yes,
of a syrupy, like, oh, all is well in
yes.
America. You could call it hope. In order to really survive healthy, you have to find a place of hope, even in adversity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be laughable. It doesn't have to be rah, rah, rah. In fact, children read insincerity very
Mm.
well. So when I say optimism, because sometimes I say about myself, I said it earlier, like maybe I'm a little Pollyanna-ish. I'm always looking at the dark side of things. But and sometimes
That's why I
parents
like
say,
you.
yeah, sometimes parents will say to me, why are you giving us the bad side of this? And I say, because even in that good, there's going to be bad, I promise you. The Pollyanna-ish is, I don't think that ruins you, right? And it can strengthen us. I faced that. Wow. And I'm still okay, even though it hurts, right? It's the ands that I think can give us strength as
Yeah.
humans.
And the authenticity, as you said, if you have a
Authenticity.
highly pessimistic parent, it's just trying to turn them slightly around to
Yeah.
give some measure of,
Yeah.
some lens that's different.
No child can go through the world hopeless. We want children to have dreams. That's what you strive for to do one day, right? You have to have some hopes and dreams to really lead a good life.
What are your hopes and dreams for your own career path in the future? Are you
Okay.
researching any? What is your next? I know you're just
Well,
finishing
next,
a project.
yeah, so I have this book coming out in September called Raising Resilience. And I'm actually doing a donor campaign where people can literally donate. It could be money for 10 books, it could be 1,000 books if they wanted, to get it in as many hands as possible. Because I feel like if I can help parents really worldwide understand this important role, not feel guilty, bad, we all make big mistakes. This is not about perfection, but how we are the buffer for our children. I think educators, professionals in the field, and parents, I'd love to have a UNICEF campaign or something. I don't know how I would do that. Like, I really would like to keep working on how can I support parents, women, children, dads, but women, I think, are their own special group worldwide. Um, and not place the blame on parents who are having a hard time or having a hard time getting through the day, but really celebrate the
Yeah.
support that they need.
All right. Well, I'm in on the plan. Thank you so much. I feel
Thank
like,
you.
obviously we've only scratched the surface, but I wish you continued success, and we'll look forward to
Thank
reading
you.
this out in full. And
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
having me. Bye.
Wonderful. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.